So like Sarah said, I'm Alena Pirok. I'm an assistant professor at Georgia Southern University. And this talk is Haunted Florida, How Tourism Shapes the Sunshine State's Dark Tourism. Right. So people in nearly every state and city in the US claim their hometown is haunted in some way. Every place with a past, with a traumatic event, or where people feel deep emotions, negative or positive, have been or will be described as haunted by someone. It doesn't take much to form a ghost story. Ghost story elements are nearly universal to any place that humans inhabit. All cities have death, dying, suffering, life-changing events, and yesterdays upon yesterdays that create what we know as the past and make a place old. Now, even Florida, with the tourism industry that markets the state as a present-day paradise, has a lingering past. Some argue that the horrors of Spanish colonialism, slavery, the mob, hurricanes, or the mysteries of the swamps give Florida a haunted feeling. All of these dark history themes are perfectly plausible paranormal reasons for hauntings. But as a historian, I'm unsatisfied and unconvinced, though fascinated by these theories. I'm more interested in the idea that places are haunted by past events and people, and how that shapes people's understanding of place. And I'm not alone. The contemporary scholars have looked at ghost lore in depth over the past 20 years. Most in this interdisciplinary field can trace their lineage back to Michael Mayerfeld-Bell's 1997 article, which argued that ghosts or the sense of a presence of a ghost or a sense of the presence of those who are not physically there is a common thread across all people's definition of place. Judith Richardson, a historian, tested this idea in the Hudson Valley area of New York. Her work argued that despite changes in the landscape markers, such as buildings or monuments, people's understanding of haunted historical places persists and builds narrative upon narrative. But that's not always the case. Many others have illustrated how ghost lore has been used to erase narratives rather than build them up. Renee Berglund argued that white Americans have traditionally used ghost stories about Native Americans to silence Native voices and to assert their non-presence. Julia King, a historical archaeologist, explained that at one site, white Civil War reenactors used talk of white Civil War ghosts to establish a narrative that they felt was less complicated than the historical park's Black American narrative. Recently, historian Taya Miles illustrated that the ghost stories told on tours in Savannah, New Orleans, and Charleston often demonize and belittle the lives of the enslaved, and do more harm than good to Americans' understanding of slavery. Now, this is what is most often called dark tourism, and it's not a positive designation. Though dark tourism is often thrown around in advertisements, and really those who fancy their tour business as a positive good or educational wouldn't really call themselves dark tourism. It's a rather strong critique. The tourism scholars who coined the term, Malcolm Fawley and J. John Lennon, created the category to describe the commodification and perhaps this cheapening of human suffering for tourism entertainment. Philip R. Stone created a dark tourism continuum that included things like ghost tours and things that highlighted recent murders, past and present genocides, and graveyards. It's a very broad category, but the basic element that all these items share is a participation in a commercial industry based on showing guests people's present or past suffering for the purposes of entertainment. So as we as a society begin to look more critically at these stories, the impulse may arise to see all ghost stories as hurtful and a category we can do without. I would call for caution on that front. Not all ghost stories are dark tourism. Though many of the stories are themselves dark or dealing with issues that make people uncomfortable, that's not really a bad thing. As sociologist Avery Gordon said, ghost stories are one way that abusive systems make themselves known and their impacts felt in people's everyday lives. And furthermore, scholars like Michael S. Bowman and Vedria Pizzula argued that calling tourist practices dark actually contributes to the already formidable body of criticism and popular opinion that attributes only vulgar, base, and superficial motives to tourism. They go on to ask, if we jettison historical tragedies as not part of the broader desire for heritage tourism, don't we continue to marginalize stories about people who are not in power by labeling their sites, the places where bad things happen, as dark and privileging the sites of those in power as heritage. Others have argued that dark tourism's assumption about tourist motives go to sites for differing reasons and allow the field to ignore the centrality of death in various societies and its symbolic meaning. One group's research looked at Auschwitz, which they pointed out that Stone called the darkest edges of the dark tourism spectrum, and rejected the dark tourism's assumption that people visit sites in question because of a fascination with death. They asserted that visitors have varying reasons for visiting, most of which are based on emotion, historical understanding, and a desire to make connections with people of the past. So yes, ghosts are dark and they're challenging, but most often they do not talk about, most often they talk about undesirable and uncomfortable pasts, but it's not a bad thing. As a scholar of historical memory, the stories people tell about ghosts emerging in the present day tell us a great deal about how people understand their relationship to the past. And this has been proven true in all my studies of ghost stories. In my research on the ghost stories in Williamsburg, Virginia at Colonial Williamsburg, I found that 20th century homeowners shared ghost stories to illustrate their home's historical significance. They would argue that the spectral presence of an unnamed Revolutionary era soldier, a long-term guest in the upstairs room, proved that their home was important during the war, and that the house maintains a special relationship to the past through that ghost. In Savannah, where I live today, the ghosts are gruesome. They chase people out of homes. They are victims of grisly murders, betrayal, and tormenting illness. And they are stuck in the city. They are trapped souls. Many of the city's 20th century ghost stories, with their gruesome nature, reflect a Southern Gothic literary tradition and transforms the city's pre-restoration decay into evidence of the South's struggle to live with and beyond its own past. In both cities and in others throughout the South, the older type of story has been joined more recently by newer tales that are deeply influenced by tourism. In Williamsburg, tourism related to Colonial Williamsburg's restoration has encouraged the development of stories set in recreated 18th century taverns that were built on the landscape in the 1930s. These stories, like those told at the Brick House Tavern, have ghosts who remind modern dwellers that the building was recreated so accurately that the past inhabitants can't tell the difference between the ones they knew in the 18th century and the ones that were created in the 1930s. In these stories, the recreations are done so well that the ghosts came back and can't tell the difference. That's a pretty good review. In Savannah, newer ghost stories are influenced by what historian Taya Miles called ghost fancy, or popular ghost culture and ghost hunting. These new stories tend to be less narrative and more assertive, and come from ghost hunters or paranormal psychics, who apply historical stories of death, betrayal, and drama to the blips and blops that they collect in their paranormal research devices, or through the cold drafts they feel in darkened rooms. And this is to authenticate the existence of historical ghosts in specific locations. These new ghost stories, though different and newer, maintain the same narratives of the past. The new ghosts in Williamsburg are still interpreted as 18th century people and continue to authenticate the historical value of recreated and restored buildings. The new ghosts in Savannah maintain a Southern Gothic tone and are interpreted as authenticating the looming and often aggressive presence of the Old South. The popularity of general tourism, and more recently of ghost stories, has encouraged the development of new kinds of ghost stories. And in looking at these sites, we can see a reliably subtle change in the stories of hauntings that people tell about each place. But when looking at Florida, the reliable narrative of subtle change is not very applicable. While tourism changed Williamsburg and Savannah, encouraged people there to present their ghost stories and their sense of the presence of the past in new ways, tourism in Florida fundamentally altered the state's identity and its vision of its past in ways that are not seen in Virginia or Georgia. So when I first took a swing at understanding Florida's ghost stories and how they function, I tried to apply what I knew from Williamsburg and Savannah, and it didn't really fit. Florida has nearly every kind of ghost story: colonial era ghosts, war ghosts, plantation ghosts, Gothic ghosts, farm ghosts, city ghosts, ghosts that are confused by restoration, ancient spirits, everything. And this is pretty normal fare for ghost stories across the United States. and they do reflect an understanding of historical place. It may come as no surprise that the stories in St. Augustine are about Spanish colonists, and the stories up in the Panhandle look a lot like the stories in Georgia and Alabama. So it's pretty normal. Florida didn't really seem to have a distinct kind of ghost story until tourism came along. Florida's ghost stories begin to become a distinct and uniquely Floridian expression of place in the early 20th century, in large part due to tourism. Now, the late 1800s, tourism, or rather tourism boosters, began to transform the human state into a paradise, where the worry of the real world did not exist. Florida was where the nation went to forget its troubles. It was a place away, a place that for visitors was temporary and not entirely real. Of course, historians have taken issue with this vision. Stephen A. Whitfield said that because of the power of the tourism vision, Florida has not been able to tell its own story, and therefore lacks authenticity because of its carefully crafted identity. He argues that Florida gained an Eudenic, or being like Eden, perfect, image because it adopted attractive styles from other destinations. The Eudenic perception of Florida within the United States is largely a product of booster print culture that advertised Florida in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Boosters knew how to fashion images and stories that would appeal to audiences, and in so doing created new faces for cities that would outshine the often far cruder realities on the ground. In the late 1800s, Florida was still largely underbuilt, economically marginal, and in some pockets on the edge of lawless. It was far from being a viable tourist destination, but pamphlets, ads, and long articles printed in newspapers throughout the nation heralded Florida's warm, healthy climate, fresh air, and curative breezes. So readers outside of Florida understood the state through advertisements, magazines, and books. And when and if they did come to Florida, they largely stayed in hotels, spas, and resorts that reflected these advertised descriptions. Perceptions, and therefore the given identity of Florida, were created after reading advertisements and seeing fancy resorts, and not much else. For those who lived in Florida, these places did not reflect what they knew of their home. The idea was so prevalent and continued to be an accepted critique that the state park markers now insist that the sandy jungle areas are the real Florida. There appears to be a tension between what residents and visitors know of the state. Historian Tracy Revels has said that Florida is tourism. He said, "There is no hope of reclaiming any other identity in Florida. Americans would never relinquish their favorite toy." But Florida's hauntings tell a different story. Florida still is tourism, but the vision is not exclusively held by tourists. Locals know it too. They live in tourism, work in tourism, and take back roads to avoid tourism. Florida's 20th century ghost stories illustrate a world built around tourism, but one that also challenges the commercial idea of paradise. Though the stories are often dark or about negative, painful, or traumatic events, in this talk, I'll be reframing some of these stories as to illustrate how they are also expressions of local place-based knowledge and help to show that the real side of Florida that exists within the fabricated tourism paradise. All right, so to understand how Florida's ghost stories help to authenticate its tourism history, let's look at a few stories that I feel exemplify this expression. The first are going to be stories from the Biltmore Hotel in Coral Gables outside of Miami. So the Biltmore Hotel was built in 1926 at the tail end of the Floridian land boom. The hotel was glamorous and made news as a high society meeting place. It hosted fashion shows, golf tournaments, and was, at the time, home to the largest pool in the world. But the high times didn't last long. The Depression threatened the hotel and its workers' livelihoods. The owners maintained its status by hosting water sport events in the huge pool that drew weary folks in. As the 1930s turned into the 1940s and World War II, the hotel was enlisted as a military and veterans hospital. After the war, the University of Miami moved in and continued to run it as a hospital until 1968. When the hospital officially closed, the huge hotel then sat abandoned and took on a new, distinctly local identity. So in the 1970s, the Biltmore became part of the local teen scene. Local woman Kim Dunzucco told WLNR in 2014 that she and her friends would sneak into the abandoned hotel to hunt for ghosts all the time. Betsy Skip, another local woman who spent her youth sneaking into the old Biltmore, said her friends always talked about how there must be ghosts in there. They would sneak out of their homes at night and go to investigate in person. Now, what would make any high school history teacher very proud? The kids always understood their experience in the hospital based on what they knew of the building and the city's history. To them, it was a hospital that treated patients from World War II and beyond. So when they crept around the halls, they prepared themselves to see bodies carelessly left over from its hospital years and World War II era ghosts. Though none of the women reported finding a body, though Dunzucco's friend swore she saw an arm once, but they all ran out before they could really investigate. Enough teens did stick around to report seeing people floating instead of walking, feeling a tap on the shoulder from an unknown person, and catching a glimpse of a World War II soldier in full uniform. For them, the hospital was not simply abandoned, it was a place where the past still lingered. And many people, of course, have stories like this. Scholars have argued that this type of useful trespassing are local rites of passage. To be old enough, brave enough, and sly enough to pass the guards and walk into the unknown darkness of abandoned hospital gave one the opportunity to show their mettle. And in so doing, the teens reclaimed the building and its past for themselves. Where once it was a hotel and then a hospital, it was now for them the site of Coral Gables' youth and rebellion. Though there were other Biltmore hotels in the nation, only theirs was haunted by their wild imaginations and classmate lore. Now, after a few decades as sort of the haunted hotspot of Coral Gables, the city paid for the hotel to be renovated and reopened it in 1987 as a hotel. Despite the return of its idyllic look, now with modern additions, the culture of the past-focused ghost lore continued. So much so that by the early 1990s, a woman named Linda Spitzer began holding weekly ghost story events in the Biltmore's lobby, and continued to do so for 10 years. Her stories came from employees, guests, and errant psychics who came to the hotel. She became the receptacle of all odd things that the hotel workers observed on their rounds and their interpretations of what they saw. Many people reported hearing babies crying, like from what they assumed was the hospital's maternity wing, while others swore that they heard a 1920s party raging on, as clear as if it was happening just behind the wall. Others saw the same floating people that the teens remembered. And what would you guess? A few of those teens had taken jobs in the revamped hotel and kept those ghost stories alive. While the stories about ghosts often took clues from the teens who made the abandoned building haunted, a few of the newer stories emerged as people began to use the hotel's early past to interpret the things that they felt when they were alone in the rooms and down long hallways. The most famous of which was the Prohibition-era gangster, Thomas Fatty Walsh. Walsh was a member of the New York Diamond Brothers gang and had rubbed elbows with big-name bosses like Arnold Rothstein and Charles Lucky Luciano. In 1929, as the Jazz Age was receding and the Depression was moving its way from the rural pockets of America and into the once booming cities, Walsh took up rooms on the 13th floor of the Biltmore Hotel. There, he set up an illicit gambling house that mingled underworld bosses, locals, traveling gamblers, and showgirls together in a raucous environment of cigar smoke and bootleg cocktails. But his party was cut short that year on March 7th, when Walsh was shot by an unknown assailant. Though his body was eventually interred, those who work at and visit the hotel say he's still around. Or, as ghost story author Greg Jenkins put it, Fatty didn't want to leave. The logic goes that the Biltmore continues to be just as nice, hospitable, and fun as it was in the 1920s. And Fatty, as a ghost, continues to bellow cigar smoke and try to lure young women to his 13th floor party pad by making the elevator malfunction. Storyteller Linda Spitzer said that when the elevator sticks on the 13th floor, it was because Fatty Walsh wants company. Now, one way to take the Walsh story is to focus on the guests. As a tourist-focused place, it's what it's wont to do. From this vantage point, the story illustrates how the seedy yet glamorous life of the 1920 mobster is still available for imaginative guests. But a different vantage point will let you focus on the hotel's workers and recognize the role they play in interpreting the things that guests perceive in the hotel and explaining them through historical events and the things that they know, thus keeping the local tradition of seeing ghosts at the hotel alive. The ghost stories and rumors allow local people who work at the Biltmore to express a specialized and maybe a little underappreciated knowledge about the hotel's past and its relationship to the city. In this way, the ghost stories, or simply the talk of ghosts, help highlight and reaffirm that the fabricated place made for guests are real. They're real places ran by and defined by real people. Up next, so the second story I want to talk to you about is the story of the 1935 hurricane and the ghost stories that emerged from the tragedy to remind everyone what locals know of storms. So living on the other side of tourism experience is a major part of life in Florida. Every seemingly perfect place has a complication that guests are not made privy to. Clean hotel rooms are the product of somebody's daily routine. At some point, they have lunch. They talk to their coworkers. They consider their grocery list. Great seafood is prepared by chefs and presented by waiters who may have gotten in a fight with their spouse that morning, caught their pants on the car door, and have other plans beyond work that day. Likewise, the sunshine and soft beach breezes are but one part of Florida's yearly weather routine. Each year, Florida is hit by or nearly hit by hurricanes. Some are small and others are devastating. The storms challenge the idea of a Floridian paradise that guests travel in droves to experience. Where the wind is sweet and the water licks upon the shores is nothing but restorative. While guests usually don't travel down for the storms, and they shouldn't, locals pride themselves on their storm apathy. There's always a larger storm that did more damage, sounded worse, or lasts longer. This is nothing, is a common phrase you'll hear around storm season. Knowing the storms, even as they roll in, is one of the ultimate Floridian flexes. It grants locals a sense of ownership over the state's true identity and lets them look tough. The same is true with ghost stories and haunted places like we saw with the teens in the Biltmore Hotel, and becomes doubly true for ghost stories about hurricanes. So before Hurricane Donna, Andrew, and Michael, really before Florida hurricanes got human names, all storms were compared to the 1935 Labor Day hurricane. It was a Category 5 that ripped through the Florida Keys on the working man's holiday. Reports had forecasted a storm coming towards the Keys, and as normal, some residents boarded up their homes and left, while others boarded up and stuck around. Going to the island during this season would have been unwise for anyone, but work needed to be done. At this point in the Great Depression, the federal government was reinvesting in infrastructure projects across the nation and hiring young men, and especially World War I veterans, who were clawing their way out of poverty. Weeks before the storm, around 700 veterans were sent to the island to work on the bridge. Half of them went to Miami for the holiday, and the other half stuck around. When the storm hit on September 2nd, it tore all of the weather recording devices away. What scientists could find afterwards led them to believe that the Herculean storm's winds raged from 150 to 200 miles per hour. For some perspective, an Amtrak train goes about 150 miles per hour at full speed. Pete Perdue, who was 5 years old at the time of the storm, told WLNR in 2016 that he witnessed the storm peel plaster off of a building and completely disintegrate the top floor of a home. But that was not all. As his family sought shelter in a bus delicately placed on a mound of building material, little Peter watched as people began to float by. While his family tried to pull folks in through the windows, they could only save so many. It was a very gruesome sight, and it would get worse as the storm raged on. Elsewhere on the island, as the storm came closer and closer, the locomotive along the 14th mile Florida East Coast Railroad chugged into town as a last hope to rescue those who were still stranded. Now, the East Coast Railroad Railway had been built in the 1890s by Henry Flagler's men with the hope that it would connect the island to Flagler's mainland resorts. Now, the line didn't become the tourist draw that he hoped, but it provided needed infrastructure for those who lived on the island. It was the main way in and out of the Keys. When the train returned to rescue the inhabitants, hopes were high. But as the train pulled away from the station, the strong winds pushed the line, all the train passengers, and the island's only exit into the sea, never to be rebuilt again. Now, across the island, the destruction leveled trees and buildings, killing 408 people and wiping out the area's bird population. It was a horrific event that continued to reveal horrors long after the storm had ended. Many of the bodies of those who lost their lives remained rotting in the humidity in the sun days after the storm, creating disturbing images that would haunt the island for generations. The island's patron, Ernest Hemingway, wrote of the many veterans whose remains he saw after the storm, saying, "You found them everywhere, and in the sun, all of them were beginning to be too big for their blue jeans and jackets that they could never fill when they were on the bum and hungry." Now, though President Roosevelt ordered their remains to be brought to Arlington for proper military burial, the humidity had caused the bodies to rot before they could be identified, let alone be picked up and sent away. By the 1940s, only a handful of years after the disaster, when the memory of the events were still fresh in locals' minds, rumors began to emerge about the sound of a steam engine being heard near the old line. Some heard the train whistle off in the distance. Others saw headlights rolling in on the phantom rails in the early hours of the morning. Some stories include visitors' confusion by the lights or the sounds, but locals always knew it was the last train, still trying to escape the storm and rescue its precious cargo. While some saw the train, others were haunted by the real-to-life human figures. When the storm ended, survivors in the Red Cross struggled to track down and identify all of whom had died. Many, like the veterans that Hemingway had observed, were too bloated and too disfigured to recognize. Others were simply lost in the swamps. Days passed with bodies appearing in the few remaining trees on the beaches, in the wetlands, and under untouched rubble. It's no wonder that those who heard of the accounts or saw the bodies themselves began to see the figures once again in the quiet, murky marshes. Numerous accounts report groups of people roaming the swamps at night, bewildered and looking for help. Stories often present visitors who are scared or confused by these sights, but locals know who they are. And while the idea of seeing the victims of the Labor Day hurricane wandering helplessly through the swamps was surely a nightmare, years later, locals began to argue that their presence was a protective omen. It seems the ghosts are said to appear when the island is in danger of being hit by another remarkable storm. And it takes a local's cool-headed understanding of hurricanes and their ghosts to read the signs. And in that way, the stories of ghosts from the 1935 Labor Day hurricane illustrate locals' recognition of the reality of island life that they knew. While pleasure seekers will find what they're looking for in the Keys, local stories of hurricanes serve a reminder that no matter how lovely a place may seem, in reality, nature has the ultimate authority. So we're sticking at the bottom of the state a little bit in this talk. So the last story is Flight 401, or the ghost stories that emerged after Flight 401. So I want to share with you stories that emerged after this crash. Now, I learned about this story rather recently while I was putting together this talk. Though I had flown down to Florida for many years before I attended graduate school, I never truly considered the role that air travel played in the state's tourism history. But in truth, air travel revolutionized Florida's tourism. It was faster than the train and the car, and the right airline could be quite luxurious. So by the 1960s, the kind of jet set culture had really sunk its teeth into mid-century Miami. While luxurious Pan Am flight was not in the cards for everyone, the image of the chic traveler was made accessible to the average American on a trip to Florida. And so air travel became a part of the real Florida. Residents, though maybe not native born, were pulled into flight and airport careers. And with them came stories that tied the air travel across the nation to Florida's tourism, and stories that illustrated how even the most secluded and seemingly real parts of Florida could not be separated from the tourism parts of Florida. No other ghost story of air travel does this quite like those that are connected to Flight 401. Now, the story of 401 begins on December 29th, 1972. Eastern Airline Flight 401 took off from New York on its way to Miami. This New York to Florida flight was a common, well-traveled jaunt. Captain Robert Alvin Loft had flown this path many times. But this time, there was something wrong with the plane. As they approached Miami, the crew noticed a light, indicating that the landing gear on the plane was not working. They radioed the tower in Miami, who advised them to enter a holding pattern and to investigate. The captain then put on the autopilot, and he and the crew dedicated themselves to addressing the light and why it was going off. While doing this, they had put their full faith in the autopilot having taken over and the steadiness of the plane. Unfortunately, their faith was misplaced. By the time that they realized that the autopilot had been bumped off and had not kept them flying, it was already too late. They had been descending and began to dive faster and faster. The jet lost 250 feet in 70 seconds and continued to drop. Co-pilot Bert Stockstill tried to redirect the plane, but it was to no avail. The men's last words were recorded on the plane's black box and attested to the heartbreaking result of simple human error. At 11:43, the plane crashed into the Everglades. It was the first jumbo jet crash in the US and the first of its kind in Florida. The wreckage was scattered over 1,600 feet in a remote area about 8 miles north of the Tamiami Trail near a flood control levee. Now, 75 people survived the crash, including 5 flight attendants, who managed to keep survivors in relative calm while they lingered in the Everglades covered in jet fuel. A man named Bob Marcus was a former member of the Coast Guard and an airboater, was the first to arrive on the scene and to begin the evacuation of the survivors. The captain and most of the crew, in addition to 96 passengers, did not survive the crash. Now, the tragedy was an absolute shock to the airline industry. And from that trauma, stories blossomed across the nation. Rumors began to swirl that Eastern Airlines had recovered parts from the Glades and used them in other planes. Flight attendants and passengers then began reporting seeing Captain Loft aboard their planes, sometimes sitting in empty seats and disappearing. Other times, he would be pointing out an object in the plane that would later be proven to be a faulty device or something that was picked up from the Everglades. One flight attendant said that he appeared to her and warned her about a microwave that would overheat. If he had not told her, she attested, the flight could have been in grave danger. In another case, a flight was canceled completely after the ghost of Captain Bob Loft appeared and disappeared in front of 3 members of the flight crew. Other stories highlighted the importance of the Glades in the story of the crash. Long understood as the realest part of the real natural environment, sightings of victims from the crash walking around the Everglades reminded listeners of the significant effect that tourism has had on Florida. Not simply the lack of reality, as some claim, but in reshaping how people understand space. The Everglades have been protected for 70 years as a natural environment, a place largely untouched by human, tourist, or local. The ghost sightings in the Glades challenge that notion, challenging the whole notion of there being a real Florida that's impervious to tourism. While many Floridians argue the tourism-centered areas of the state don't reflect the real or true Florida, the effects of tourism and the memories held by those touched by the tourism industry are as real as the Everglades themselves. Now, there are, of course, so many more ghost stories in Florida than the 3 I've presented here. Each city, town, and region has its own set of tales that reflect how locals understand place and what events and histories they see as important. But if you look around you, you'll find that there's far more 20th century stories than older tales. But that's not for lack of ghostly thinking in Florida before tourism. It's simply for lack of concerted writing. People have always told ghost stories, but it wasn't really until the 20th century that people began to really really make efforts to write it all down. And with this, we get more ghost stories and more of a certain type. As people consume more and more ghost stories, they get a better idea of what people expect from ghosts and how and why they haunt. As a result, you'll see a lot of the same stories repeat over and over again in different places. And it's not hard to find a heartbroken woman haunting any old place. There are people trying to get back home or find something they lost, or people reliving some grand or traumatic experience. The key to understanding the tales historically, as opposed to paranormally, is to first accept that they're human-made tales and to consider their context. The location of a story matters more than the style of the haunt. The events that are said to cause a haunting matter more than the number of sightings. And who tells the story matters more than how scary it is. By looking at ghost stories this way, we can maybe sleep a little sounder after hearing a bunch of ghost stories, and are better able to understand how people situate the past within the landscape, and the landscape that they live in today, most importantly. In the case of Florida, ghost stories can reveal how locals are using dark histories to incorporate tourism into the very real history of Florida. Thank you.